Hey guys, welcome to Bethel Online. My name is Jason. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're so glad you decided to make us a part of your weekend. No matter who you are, where you come from, we're so glad you're here. Our vision is to be a safe place for real people to encounter the real Jesus and experience real change. Our hope and our prayer is that no matter who you are or what you've been through, you know that you are loved and you are wanted here. We would love to get to know you better and help you connect with all that's going on. You can do this by going to our website at www.bethel.us or by downloading the Bethel app. You can find our app by searching Bethel Putco in your app store. Both online and in the app, you can fill out a digital connection card. It only takes a minute and it'll help us know how to serve you better. Another way you can connect today is through giving. Your generosity at Bethel directly impacts God's mission to radically change people's lives in Putnam County and beyond. Through the ministries of Bethel and the many local and regional organizations we support, people are able to see the grace of God and how much He loves them. You can always give on our website at bethel.us/give or in the Bethel app. Thank you for partnering with us and making a difference. Well, thanks again for tuning in online today. Know that you are wanted and welcome here, and you are loved. I hope you all have a great day.
Good morning, friend. Thank you for joining us this morning for Bethel Online. We're so glad that you've taken part of your morning to connect with our church. We would love the opportunity to connect with you. Let us know that you watched this morning by emailing hello@bethel.us. We'd love to find a way to get you connected with what God is doing here at Bethel, where we believe when real people like you, people like me, encounter Jesus, it can change absolutely anything. We've been in a series that we started back in November, and then we took a break during the month of December, and then we've restarted it here in January. And this series is called The Essentials. In the first month of this series, back in November, we said that there are some things that are essential to the Christian faith. And we began to look at the teachings of Jesus and begin to see, what did Jesus seem to think was essential? And we said above all of the things that a person could argue are essential, that loving God, loving people, and living on mission were clear points that Jesus makes that were essential above all things. That for the person who's a Christian, who has chosen to devote their life to Jesus, there are some essentials. Now, maybe you're watching this morning and you aren't a Christian and you're just checking things out. And maybe you look at this up against your experience of Christian people and you're like, I don't know that I see this. You can be assured that while maybe you haven't experienced that from God's people, that God is all about loving us, that He loves you. And because He loves you, He wants to be loved back. And He loves you, and because He loves you and His love and His grace is incredibly powerful, He wants you to love those around you. And that because He loves you, you have a purpose and a mission in this life to share with others this great news that there is a God, that He cares about them and wants a relationship with them. And He has called us to those things. And so in the first month, we talked about how everything we do as a church has to have these principles of loving God, loving people, and living on mission. And last week, we talked about how the mission of God for His people is within the context of the church to gather together to go out and share the good news. So part of how we gather and we work together is to support the local church. We're supposed to independently go out and make disciples, but we as a church together gathered have a responsibility of making disciples. There's a story in Luke chapter 9, verse 12 through 17, and Jesus has gathered up His disciples, and He's gathered up a crowd of people because Jesus was a gatherer of people. And He begins to teach. And as He teaches, the disciples who are trying to follow Him but still learning His ways, they come up to him with a problem. Today, I want to talk to you about how it's essential for the followers of Jesus to support the mission of God. God has called us to be a local church that goes out and preaches the good news of God's grace and love for humanity. How do we go about that? We step in to support that mission. These disciples have kind of stepped in with Jesus as he's teaching. And it says late in the afternoon, the 12 disciples, there was a crowd there, and then there were the 12 men who were closest to Jesus. They came to Jesus and said, send the crowds away to nearby villages and farms so they can find food and lodging for the night. Now, I think the disciples were trying to be helpful here. I don't think they were trying to lack faith. I think they were seeing a practical problem, and it seemed that maybe Jesus just kept teaching and that the problem was going to become bigger. And so he sends them away so they could find food and lodging for the night. That's what they're seeing as the problem, the solution to this problem. All of these people are thronging around Jesus, wanting to hear about him, and yet the disciples are actually trying to kind of disperse this moment because they see a problem that's going to become a big deal. They said, there's nothing to eat here in this remote place. But Jesus said, you feed them. They were telling Jesus, they were kind of giving Jesus their plan of how this was going to work best. I think maybe they had a strategic meeting and they thought, hey, listen, we can try to get together and have some food. We can, this story is told in all 4 Gospels. And I think that maybe they had kind of gotten off the side and said, hey, look, if Jesus keeps talking here, like it's going to get wild around here when nobody gets to eat. And people just seem interested in what Jesus is doing here. But like, we can't stay here all night. Like, how will we rest? We can't stay here all night. Like, people are going to get hungry. And man, you know what happens when Jewish people get hangry, and when all of these people who are coming to Jesus start getting angry or frustrated, and we've called them to listen, but they're going to get frustrated. And Jesus' response to them is not, don't make it their problem to come to me and then provide in all these ways. You feed them. So part of the mission of getting people to Jesus is Jesus calls them to support the mission. They said, but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This is just, in their estimation, this is just looking at the problem and looking at their ability for a solution on their own. He said, are you expecting us to go buy enough food for this whole crowd? For there were about 5,000 men there. That means there were probably about 15,000 people, but when you include women and children. Jesus replied, tell them to sit down in groups of about 50 each. So the people all sat down. Now, one of the other accounts of this says that a little boy had brought 5 loaves and 2 fish. Notice that it wasn't immediately that the disciples came with the 5 loaves and 2 fish. There was a boy that came with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus takes this generous offering of a little boy who maybe had his sack lunch, right? Now, I want you to stop for a minute, because do you really believe that 5,000 people were all here and no one else brought a sack lunch? That only one mother in the whole place thought, Johnny's going to need something to eat today, and just gave him some loaves and fish? The likelihood is that within this group of people, everyone saw their own limitation and their own need to eat. But this one little boy, not the disciples, not the large crowd, but this little boy offers up his fish. And I love what happens here. It appears that the disciples had looked at what was available, and all they saw was 5 loaves and 2 fish. But Jesus, when he takes the 2 fish, he looks up toward heaven. You see, oftentimes when it comes around to supporting the mission of God, we look around at what's in our hands, what's in someone else's hands, and and we neglect to look to heaven and to God, for God to bless them. And so Jesus blesses it. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread and the fish to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. Notice Jesus didn't just make it fall into the basket right in front of the people. He called the disciples to support the mission by taking what they had collected outward. And he kept giving the fish and the bread to the disciples, and they began to distribute it to the people. What we had was an impossible problem and a lack of a solution, but it didn't mean there wasn't a resource at hand. And when the resources at hand got to the hands of Jesus and were given blessing to God, they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. I think the disciples, much like us, wondered how would there be enough? Well, is this a solvable problem with just us alone? And the answer was no. As Christians in our culture today, there's such a need for good news to the world. And the challenges and resources that we seem to have in our hands can often feel like not enough. Well, the first point I would want you to notice from this passage is that Jesus seems to want the disciples, and if you're a disciple, Jesus wants you and me to help feed his crowds. The crowds were not yet fully committed to Jesus. They were merely hearing from Jesus. Jesus in Luke chapter 9:13 says, you feed them. So often, I think we can look to the heavens and look to God to solve a problem, but he's calling us to begin to be the solution and offering to be the enough that we need. Well, Jesus doesn't just say, hey, just hold on a minute, I got this, snap. Jesus calls them to support the mission. I'll be really honest with you. We can often look at what's to come for our church and the challenges ahead and the opportunities ahead and say, but how will we ever do that? The truth is, God doesn't call us to use what we don't have yet. He calls us simply to bring to him what is fully devoted to him, to bring it to him. He has the ability, but he does call them to begin the process. So often we want to see the miracle, but we don't want to see the process. And sometimes it's by stepping into faith. Can you imagine the faith of the little boy who handed his stuff to Jesus and had to have wondered, is my mom going to be mad at me, or because I gave away my sack lunch? You know, when your mom comes home after a long day and she's like, hey, did you eat anything today? Jesus expects me to feed his crowds. As a church, we're growing rapidly. As far as a rural church goes, we're growing pretty rapidly. We have actually, our attendance in 2023 was 100 more each Sunday than it was in 2022. We've begun the year, we ended the year with a service with 676 people. We had a record number of people be baptized into faith last year. Nearly 85 people made a first-time decision to follow Jesus at Bethel last year and were baptized. And that's great news. The truth is, oftentimes when it comes to supporting the mission of the church, it's something we have to graduate into and grow into. We come to a knowledge and a relationship of Jesus, and for a while, it takes us a while to get around. And I've often experienced when it comes to money or resources, it's often one of the last things we learn to trust God with. And so what you can see here is that God's calling to those who have already have called themselves his disciples is for them to give generously from what they have. And maybe in this moment, the disciples who were claiming to be the closest followers of Jesus weren't quite to the place of the little boy who really trusted the rabbi with his food. But Jesus expects me to give generously from what I have. Jesus doesn't expect you to give from someone else's stores. Jesus expects us to give from what we have. In John chapter 5, verses 5 and 6, the story goes this way. It says, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, Jesus knew what he was going to do already, but he asked Philip, and the scripture says that he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. I think he wanted Philip to see that the issue ahead was insurmountable without him. I think he was teaching Philip that stepping out in faith, like this little boy was going to step out in faith, that stepping out in faith was what God called him to do. We got to do some things to get to a place of generosity. And yes, I'm unapologetically, listen, if you're just watching today and you're checking out church and you're trying to learn about Jesus, by all means, hang out with us. But if you call yourself a disciple of Jesus, I'm unapologetically asking you to support the mission of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the mission of your local church. If you call yourself a part of Bethel, I'm asking you in the same way that as a dad, that I recognize my part within my church family or within my own personal family. It's like, I wouldn't bring home a baby and be like, hey, you gotta come up with $800 a month of rent, or you gotta come up with the house payment and the electrical bill and all of that stuff. That's almost humorous to think. But because I'm the dad, because I'm gonna do what I can to support my family. My wife and I are gonna come around each other and we're gonna do what we have to do to support our family. And because we are called to be a part of God's family, we also consider ourselves as responsible for doing our part to help contribute to support the work of God through the local church. So how do we get there to a place of giving generously? I think the first thing we have to do is get a personal vision for how we give to God. Isaiah 32 verse 8 says, but generous people plan to do what is generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. See, Jesus was testing Philip when he showed him the problem. He was testing to see where Philip was. And when we step out in generosity and when we give, we can often try to reverse that and somehow test God. And there are false teachers all over the place that tell us if you give, you'll get rich. Give $19 a month to support, such and such's ministry and you'll be blessed. You're going to experience an overflow. And I want to be careful not to step into that, because the reality is if you choose to give, your bottom line may very likely be less than it is right now. But I do believe God blesses a generous heart and generous spirit. And I do believe that God provides enough for his kids. But generous people plan. That it's really easy to say, well, if there's enough. But I've noticed over the years as financial situations have shifted for myself, and as I've watched people, we can often say, well, one day when there's enough, I'll be generous. But in reality, what often happens is the bar moves is what I consider enough. That we often look comparatively, well, when I can, go on a couple trips and I can do this and I can have that, then I'll be generous. But what that usually means is that I never get to the place, because the bar moves constantly for me to decide what's enough. So what was enough? I mean, food's here's a great thing, a great idea. How much food is enough? How much is enough? Like, the truth is, if you look in our culture today, there's a great problem with obesity, which lends us to believe that what we eat and how much we eat is part of the problem, right? That most of us are getting more than enough. But generous people plan out ahead, and then they stand firm in their generosity. How do we do that? We pray and we ask God and we seek God and we seek his guidance in Scripture about giving and about tithing. But we also ask God and we wrestle with God. God, what are you calling me to give? And I don't know what happened in the inner workings of the little boy in this story, but I find it pretty powerful that while standing in the midst of these men, women, and this massive crowd, that some reason this little boy was at a place to trust the rabbi with what he had. I don't know if maybe he planned on giving away, but at some point I think he felt compelled to give it away. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7 says, you must each decide in your heart how much to give. And don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. I don't like talking about money in a way that makes you feel guilty if you're not. That's just not the way that I work. I don't believe that that's how God wants his church to go about talking about giving and support. I believe Jesus' teachings need to be taught, and Jesus is teaching in many places about generosity and giving, and he teaches in many places about the importance of his local church. But he does say each of you should decide in your heart how much to give. So what does it look like to ask God what you should give? And many of you are like, well, God would or wouldn't want this, but have you really opened up the door for God to lead you to give? Would you be obedient if God gave you a number? Would you be obedient if God said, hey, all of your fish and bread? Would you, because many of us often, we're like, well, I want to hear from God, I want to hear from God, but have we opened our heart to hear from God when it comes to generosity? The second thing I have to do to become generous is work through my scarcity mentality. Can I just tell you that food is a struggle for me? I would say of all the things in the world that I don't want to be, hungry is pretty high on the list. I'm not so sure if I were in this crowd that with my own baggage and my own history that I wouldn't have wanted to slip off to the side and keep my fish and my bread and my little sack lunch for me. Like maybe I would slowly be pulling pieces out of my pocket, fake coughing and tucking a little bit of the food in there, because if I let everyone see what I had, they might want some of it. I struggled, man, back when like they started saying they were going to, change the hours of grocery stores and that people were hoarding food. Like I have to just be honest with you. I made a couple trips to the store for things that I knew would sustain us for a long time, and I wasn't full-blown prepper, but I did put up a new shelf in the basement, and I did make sure that we had all of the consumable stuff, lots of canned foods and dried beans and rice, and is because in my mind, there's always this fear of being enough or having enough. And I've recognized that what that does for me is that every time I get scared or nervous or threatened, I begin to hoard. It's funny, at the end of the day, I wind up like a year and a half later and like, we're still like cooking COVID food that we bought back in 2019 or 2020. It's like, we still got, 2 or 3 cases of green beans in the basement. Don't buy any green beans for a while. And that mentality, that scarcity mentality means that every time I get pressed in, I have this temptation to go and hoard. And I can look back on my life, friend, and see that God has provided for me in so many ways, in so many times. But we have to work through that scarcity mentality that really there never was a massive shortage of food during 2020. It was the fear of it and for me, it was the lack of trusting that God was going to provide. We have to work through that mentality. Philip's first response, as many of us, and if we're honest, we often could step into this too, was look, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough to solve this problem, Jesus. Like us 12 could not feed this group of people. Like that's bigger than a wedding feast. That's a massive amount. And a little bit later, they'll be hungry again. Like, Jesus, we have a problem. We're out in the middle of nowhere and you want us to feed these people. And so often, enough is often the enemy of my faith, because the needle of what's enough always moves. I remember getting my first cell phone. And I was just amazed at the fact that, like, on my way back home from college, like, I could have a conversation with someone that because I grew up in an era where you didn't even make long distance calls unless you had to. Where now I could call anywhere in the world after 9 o'clock. It used to be that after 9 o'clock you could call anybody and it was free after 9 o'clock. Other than that, you had 200 minutes a month. And I got that first cell phone. I was like, it felt like power in my hands. It was amazing. But if you tried to give me that cell phone to manage my life today, I would be like, this isn't sufficient. This isn't enough. Because right now, like, I can change the temperature in my home while I'm standing here. I can message my children. I can email anyone around. I can literally change where the money is in a bank account or an investment account. And I would say that it's not enough, but there was a day in my life when it was far more than enough. Another thing I think we have to do to step into generosity is learn to celebrate it. In John chapter 6, verse 8 and 9, Simon Peter's brother spoke up and he said, hey, there's a young boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? He was not noticing whose hands he was willing to put it in. See, the enough is Jesus. Charles Stanley has a quote that says, God takes full responsibility for the life that is wholly devoted to him. We should celebrate generosity as one of the essential traits of the Christian. That living life with open hands. God, what I have is yours. It will return to you when I'm gone, but in the meantime, God, my life is wholly devoted to you. And Jesus took those 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked to the heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread and fish to the disciples so they could distribute it to many. Do you think the disciples were impacted by this moment of seeing the little be enough? Do you think that moving forward, they were a little more willing after their own stomachs had been filled to hand what they had to Jesus? Don't miss this. While I believe this miracle was to show Jesus' power over a lot of things, I believe that part of this passage is a passage about generosity and what happens when we put what God calls us to put in the hands of his mission and support his mission. These disciples got to be a part of something incredible. And what was incredibly good news about the power of God was experienced by thousands of people. Can you imagine what would happen in a community if God's people were truly generous? Now, this is where oftentimes the pastor who teaches on this subject says, if you give to God, he will bless you abundantly. And then they tell a story about giving and getting more money back. And while I'm not saying God can't do that, I don't believe that was the point of the passage. How many people knew more deeply the character of the God who was enough because of this generosity? The disciples knew Jesus differently. The people experienced Jesus in a new way. And I believe their trust, their belief, their faith grew because of it. As they ate the leftovers. Friend, I'm going to ask you to do a couple things today. Seek God's will and guidance for your personal giving. I believe personal giving is an essential to the life of a person who is fully devoted to Jesus. I'm not telling you exactly what you should do, but I'm asking you to ask God for clear conviction and be prepared to act when God prompts you. Be listening, be looking. Number 2, I want to ask you to begin praying for our giving initiative that's coming this spring. As we look to continue to expand, to feed the people the good news of Jesus Christ. Begin to pray that God will deal with you individually, that God will deal with our church as a whole, toward this moment of generosity, that we can experience God in the way that the people who were here around this miracle experienced God. And I want you to know today, as I teach this message, that I'm not a pastor who is sitting here expecting you to do something I won't and don't do. I am fully committed to supporting the mission of this local church as God has called me to, financially, physically, with my service. And I would just encourage you that as we move forward, what we can experience as a church that's wholly devoted to Jesus is incredible. I love you, and have a great week.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Are you ready to take your next step? We would love to hear from you. You can send an email to hello@bethel.us. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can let us know in the Bethel app. And speaking of the Bethel app, take a moment, if you haven't already, to go to your app store and search Bethel Putco to download our app. There's all kinds of great resources in the app. You can listen to messages, you can view the messages from Sunday morning, and you can also fill out a digital Connect card. You can do that today and each week to let us know that you're tuning in. You can also find some great information about our Bethel Kids Ministry and our Be the One student ministries. Also in the app, you can give. It's one of 3 ways you can give: with online giving at bethel.us/give, in our app, Bethel Putco, or through text. Hey, thanks again for joining us. We hope you have a great day and know that you are loved.